Sarah that if they just killed Dyson, the man who practically created Skynet in the first place, this would all go away. Now, normally, when a plan like this is formulated, someone will come along and pontificate about the matter, saying that they must not change the timeline, and if they do, then the space-time continuum will unravel and the universe will be destroyed. But the Terminator hears of this plan, and he says, you know, that might actually work. This is one of the most interesting points in the whole film, because everything has now doubled back on itself. By trying to kill off Dyson, Sarah is in fact doing exactly what was done to her in the first film. She is taking what at this time is an innocent life in order to change the future as she wants it to be changed. And as the scene unfolds, we learn that Dyson is actually a really nice guy. The film totally turns around on itself at this point. We feel for Dyson and his family, and it is suddenly Sarah who we want to stop. The question is also raised as to whether it is acceptable to kill another human being. Killing Dyson might have actually prevented the war, but at this point in time, Dyson is guilty of nothing. It makes you think about what you would do if you could go back in time and kill, say, a ruthless dictator before they reached ruthless dictator status. And of course, we must not forget to mention one of the most memorable and most of all threatening villains of all time, the T-1000. Arnold is a big guy, and he was very threatening in the first Terminator film. So it would have been really easy for the writers to go bigger when it came to his opponents in this film. Instead, we get a little guy. He looks like he'd have a hard time forcing a rusted door open. But this is actually to the villain's credit. Watching this little dude toss Arnold around like he's nothing adds an extra layer of menace to his character. This is not a brute crashing through walls. It is a cold, deadpan shapeshifter bent on your destruction. And if he can take Arnold down, you don't stand a chance. Seeing this guy merely look at another character the wrong way gives me chills, which is something that the first Terminator just couldn't manage to do. T-1000 is definitely high on my greatest movie villain list. Eventually the characters decide to stop Judgment Day by destroying the genesis of Skynet altogether. Every arm, every chip, everything. Now, a word about plot holes, because as I've said before many times, no paradox that I am aware of has ever made absolute sense in a film, and this is no exception. For some reason, I have developed a reputation for being the guy who can spot plot holes. Well, I want to make something ridiculously clear on that point. Plot holes are not automatically problems. Plot holes are absolutely unavoidable, and I have never seen a movie that didn't have them. If you go into a project limiting what you do in the story because you're afraid of creating plot holes, then you as a writer wouldn't get very much done, and the story would suffer because of it. I repeat, plot holes are not problems. They only become problems when your story, dialogue, and or characters don't justify any of them. Star Trek Generation. At the end of the film, all of the chips and whatnot are destroyed, and the good Terminator sacrifices himself so that no one could ever follow in Dyson's work. We later get the indication that all is well and Judgment Day has been stopped. Now, the problems with this are obvious. If Skynet never happened, it means there was no future war, which means Kyle Reese never went back in time and fathered John, which means John doesn't exist, and the whole thing could never have happened in the first place. Had this film been bad, this would have been unacceptable. But as it was an outstanding screenplay, story, and film with outstanding performances all around, this detail carries no weight against the film. It truly is a masterpiece. On a personal note, here is one of my favorite scenes from the film. Arnold walks into a biker bar completely naked and approaches one of the patrons. He looks him up and down and says, "I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle." What the hell do you say to something like that? I have seen this movie a zillion times, and that never fails to crack me up. This is one of those films that can be enjoyed no matter how many times you see it. It also has the added benefit of being largely standalone. So even if you've never seen any of the other Terminator films, you will still be able to watch this one. And I must say that for all the franchise's ups and downs, it remains my absolute favorite. And it truly is one of the best films I have ever seen. The end. movies, Broadway movies, Manwich movies, shouldn't have been made. Say hello to Matthew. I'm going to say this as simply as I can. Mission to Mars was made by a few people who had clearly seen Apollo 13 and the Abyss a few million times too many. This is where we get into the problem of the difference between inspiration and identity. Is this a work that was inspired by other works, or is it trying to be those other works? Well, in my view, it turned out to be mostly both, but it leans too heavily on trying to be those other movies in too many places. Particularly the beginning. It's almost an exact replica of the opening scene from Apollo 13. And the end of the film, which is ridiculous by the way, is strikingly similar to the ending of The Abyss, only with one ludicrous twist. The plot boils down to this. A team on Mars discovers a very strange object that killed all but one of them. That one is now trapped on Mars, and the other team has to come and rescue him. This leads into a story that is dry, mostly predictable, and far too familiar. Don't get me wrong, the identity crisis this film has is not its only problem. The characters are good enough that every line out of their mouths is obviously scripted. We have the obligatory conversation about how this one guy was gung-ho about the mission, but he dropped out due to a personal tragedy. What a shame. Then we have a conversation about how he's the best man for the job, that he washed himself out of the program. He did it to himself, and why should we give him another chance? It all sounds and feels unnatural and at times awkward. No one talks this way. The film also suffers from some harsh transitions. Everything is constantly jumping ahead in time, and it happens so abruptly that it almost feels arbitrary. Like the times they jumped over would have been just as worthwhile to watch as where they transitioned to. There's also the problem of pace in this movie. I'm all for writers taking their time to tell a story, for example, in The Abyss or even Blade Runner. Those two films may have been slow, or hell, even boring in a lot of areas, but the story was more than enough to pull you through without noticing the time. But in Mission to Mars, a lot of the scenes just feel tedious. There's a lot of talent in this film as far as the cast goes. Gary Sinise, Tim Robbins, and Don Cheadle are all actors that I like a great deal. But what this film is missing are any good performances. Every actor delivers their lines as if they've done it all before. And considering they actually casted Gary Sinise as an astronaut who was washed out of the program at the last minute, that fact almost comes off as unintentionally hilarious. The characters and the dilemmas that they find themselves in just feel too routine. You almost feel as if they know what kind of movie they're in. There's a lot of weird crap that goes on in the beginning and in the end, and no one acts as surprised or horrified as they should. It all feels watered down. Another problem this film suffers from is the director's inability to set up a good shot. Now that isn't much of a problem until the way the shot is set up has actual bearing on whether the scene works or not. We have a trite scene where a man is standing in front of the camera. He moves, and there's another man standing right behind him. The scene is supposed to be startling, but, well, I could sort of see him back there. I swear to you that an elbow or some such thing was in the shot, and this was totally missed by the director. Yet another moment in the film where it was unintentionally funny. But as bad as the film is, it's not a total loss. It's not as if there aren't any positives in the film at all. One of the more interesting elements is that the issue of distance, gravity, momentum, and time are taken fully into account. This does not feel routine. In fact, it sets Mission to Mars apart from most other science fiction films where in space you can do whatever you want. You can't just warp to Mars in this movie. It takes a long time to get there and back. They also deal with the issue of fuel when it comes to zipping around through space in a jetpack. If you build up too much momentum, you'll just float off into nowhere, or, if you're really unlucky SOB, into the atmosphere of a planet. This leads into a not-so-bad scene in the film, but the resolution is far too predictable. There are a few nice scenes in this movie. We have one scene where two of the mains are dancing in zero gravity to the Van Halen song Dance the Night Away, which I enjoyed.